Hey, what's going on YouTube? It's Josh from Crack MTG here, and today I want to talk about some budget competitive pre-modern decks that you can be playing in 2025 to have a good shot at doing well in a large tournament. These are all going to be relatively common decks that you will see in the metagame that can be built for really cheaply, all of them under $75. So I really recommend, if you are a established pre-modern player, you can put one of these lists together in order to have an extra deck to play against, or if you are a newer player, these are going to be definitely some of the best decks that you can use to get started to have a competitive shot at a tournament. Also, if you are an established player, I really encourage you to send this to a friend who you've been meaning to get into pre-modern to help grow this format, and also just because this is going to be a really great resource to help newer players get started playing competitive decks. So the decks that I want to show off today are going to be Blue-Green Madness, Mono-Red Burn, and Black-White Control. So we kind of have decks all over the spectrum of playstyle. Blue-Green Madness being kind of like a synergy-based mid-range deck, Mono-Red being all in on aggro, and Black-White being all in on control. These are some very, very fun and strong decks that you can use to get started playing the format. Some disclaimers. All of these lists are going to be purchasable on Card Kingdom for under $75 as of the time of recording. That was one of my biggest goals when making all of these lists. Something really important about Premodern is that gold border printings of cards are legal, so you should definitely use and abuse that whenever you can. Gold border printings are often much cheaper than their black border alternatives, so I would really recommend using the gold border printings of cards when you can find them. And also, some card choices in these lists are going to be based on financial restraint. The best example I can give of this is the Sly deck is not going to be playing fetch lands. Obviously, if you are a new player but have been playing Magic for a while, you may have fetch lands, and you should totally sleeve those up in your version of Sly then. But in order to make these lists as budget-friendly as possible, some cards have been chosen to be cut. And lastly, the lists are all going to be based heavily on winning decks from MTG Top 8. I wanted to stick pretty strictly to what has been shown to do well and not give you guys brews. I want to show off what some of the most competitive and consistent decks you can build are in Premodern for newer players and for established players alike. The very first deck that I want to show off is Mono-Red Burn. This is one of the most popular decks of the format, up there with Mono-Blue Dreadnought and Goblins. This deck is all in on aggression, trying to curve out, getting very efficient and high damage creatures out in the early turns, and then follow them up by your burn effects in order to finish off the opponent very quickly. However, its playstyle can kind of change, as depending on the matchup, you may want to think a little bit more critically about how you want to sling your burn spells. This is also going to be the cheapest list that we're going to be looking at today, so I definitely encourage you, if you do not have it already, consider sleeving up something like this. The list that I'm going to be using is not playing any fetch lands, which is going to be the biggest distinction from other common burn lists, and it also has caused some other small changes to the list, but most of it is pretty stock. We're going to be playing 3 Ball Lightning. This is one of our best high-end damage spells, as it can deal 6 damage for just 3 mana and 1 card, which is absolutely awesome. You don't usually want to play a 4th copy of this card, as it is a little bit slow and can get clogged in your hand, but it is definitely a very strong finisher. Goblin Patrol is one that I'm going to be running in this budget version, but it has been a little bit power crept out of the format. It was most commonly played in older builds of Burn, but it is still very efficient as a 1-mana 2/1. You do have to pay 1 on your second turn to keep it around, but that is still a very large body on turn 1 in Premodern, and Burn is generally okay with curving out in that way. Maybe you do a turn 1 Goblin Patrol, turn 2 Pay the Echo, and then also drop another 1-drop, right? I'm playing a few Grim Lavamancers. I'm trimmed down from the 4 that most lists are running because we're not able to use fetch lands, but this is one of the best creatures in the deck, as it can be a repeatable damage source that can also choose where you put it, so you can easily take out multiple creatures with this card or just get a whole lot of damage to the face. Jackal Pup is a 1-mana 2/1 with a slight downside, but 1-mana 2/1s in this format are very, very efficient, so this card is absolutely great, especially being in red, of course. Even though it is kind of worse than Savannah Lions, it is very, very, very strong in this format. Getting 2 damage a turn for just 1 mana is awesome. Mogg Fanatic, of course, is the other one to round out the creature suite. 1-mana 1/1, and you can sack it to deal 1 damage to anything. This creature is also just incredibly efficient, but is also a guaranteed 1 damage burn spell. The burn suite that we're playing: 4 Fire Blast, 4 Incinerate, 1 Lava Dart, and 4 Lightning Bolt. These are some of the most efficient burn spells in the format. The one of Lava Dart is mostly for the mirror match or just other decks that are playing a lot of 1 toughness creatures, and being able to be flashed back to potentially 2-for-1 your opponent is quite good. 4 Fire Blasts is your main way to finish off your opponent. You don't want to cast this spell until it is your very last one to kill your opponent, but very, very efficient as it is a free source of 4 damage. And then Incinerate and Lightning Bolt are essentially the same card, but Incinerate costing 1 more. You just need a lot of 3 damage effects in your deck. Playing a couple of Cursed Scroll. This is one of the gold border cards that I was talking about that is a lot cheaper if you're getting it in gold border. This is just a really good recurring damage source, as you can pay 3 a turn to essentially have it deal 2 damage if you have 1 card in hand. If you use the timing of your turns well, you will almost always have 1 card in your hand, just because this deck also dumps cards very quickly. The last cards to round out the main deck are 4 Seal of Fire to deal damage. This is just essentially a shock on an enchantment. It is a little bit better than Shock in my opinion because it can be cast out earlier, and so it can kind of dodge counter magic in some ways. And we're also playing a few Sulfuric Vortex because it is another great repeatable damage source, and it stops life gain for those pesky Exalted Angels and things like that. The land base is very simple because we're not playing any fetch lands, just 20 mountains, and then because we're not playing fetch lands to fuel the yard, just a singleton Barbarian Ring. Looking at the sideboard, this is also fairly stock. We're going to be playing 1 Anarchy and 1 Flaring Pain. These are mostly for white decks that are going to be bringing in Circle of Protection red from their board, so either destroying that or making it so that they can't prevent our damage is going to be great, but of course they both have their own other situations where they might be useful, like Anarchy taking out Exalted Angels. We have a couple of Earthquakes. These are great for dealing with elves and goblins and other decks that are just going to swarm you really quickly. You can wipe the board and get a couple damage into their face. Playing a full 4 Overload. This is just the best answer to Dreadnought in red, I would say. For just 1 mana, an instant, you can destroy a Dreadnought. That's really all this card needs to say, and that's why we're playing it. We have a few Pyroblasts in order to counter blue spells. This helps against the Dreadnought matchup, but also just decks with a lot of counter magic, and blue decks are going to have access to their own Hydroblasts, so you want to be able to keep up with them by having your own Pyroblasts. A 4th Sulfuric Vortex in the board for more control slowy decks that you need to get recurring damage in for, and then also a few Tormod's Crypts for very unfair graveyard decks that you're going to need to stop quickly because they could potentially go faster than your burn effects. The second deck that I want to show off here today is Black-White Control. This is a much more slow deck. It's going to be kind of more a control or mid-range strategy, trying to go 1-for-1 with your opponent in the early game with effects like Swords to Plowshares, Vindicate, and Duress, and then later in the game try to overwhelm your opponent with more large creatures that they generally cannot deal with just a single card. Things like Eternal Dragon are great, Decree of Justice, and Exalted Angel. This deck really cares about making its land drops and is very, very powerful. It has very high card quality, so the average card that you're playing is just much better than your opponent's average card, and that is kind of how you hope to win. This is definitely a very, very strong deck. I used to play it personally. However, with the prevalence of Parallax Tide, I think it might be a little bit weak in the meta, but let's take a look at this list. We're going to be playing a few Eternal Dragons. This card can be plane cycled and then can repeatedly be brought back from your graveyard and then cast as a 5/5 flyer. What makes this card absolutely insane is that it is a single card value engine that also closes out the game because it grabs you a land, so it already replaced itself, and then later in the game, once you have enough mana, you can start bringing this back from your graveyard. And remember, it got you the land to help you start doing that. And then once you're bringing it back from your graveyard, you can keep plane cycling it to get even more mana. And then once you have all the mana in the world, you can just keep bringing it back as a 5/5 flyer that essentially can never die because you can just keep bringing it back. This card is absolutely great in the grindy games and super, super strong in the deck. We're also playing for Exalted Angel. This card is probably the best white creature in Premodern. It is super efficient as a 6-mana 4/5 flyer with essentially lifelink, but it also has Morph for 4, so you can get this body out on turn 4 by just curving turn 3 Morph, turn 4 flip. So this card is absolutely amazing because it beats the aggressive decks, is super, super great at gaining life and blocking creatures, but also curves out really well because it gives you both a turn 3 and turn 4 play that are very efficient off of just one card. We're playing a few Decree of Justice. Like I said, this is our other big winner. You can cycle it for 3, and when you do, you can pay any amount, and you make that many 1/1s. So at instant speed for 3 and X, you can make a bunch of 1/1s and also draw the card from cycling. But you can also just dump a ridiculous amount of mana in it with its normal cost to make 4/4 Flying Angels to kill your opponent that way. For Duress, for Gerard's Verdict, these are absolutely great hand disruption tools. Duress looking at your opponent's hand, of course, and taking a non-creature, non-land, and Gerard's taking 2 cards at once. This card is absolutely amazing and one of the things that makes this deck so efficient. It also can gain you a little bit of life, so that helps with the burn matchup as well. Vindicates is just super efficient removal. Couple of Wrath of Gods because we're not on many creatures, and the creatures that we are on can come back like Eternal Dragon, or can just be made, we can make many creatures at once with like Decree of Justice, so we're very light on creatures, so Wrath of God is pretty good in this list. We're also on a couple of Skeletal Scryings as a great way to refuel our hand. 1 Smother for a little bit more removal to accompany our 4 Swords to Plowshares, so we have a ton of removal. Couple of main deck Phyrexian Furnaces. You can get this in Gold Border to get it even cheaper, but this is a great tool for the early game to deal with problematic graveyard decks, especially things like Replenish, because this deck does struggle with that a little bit. And 1 main deck Seal of Cleansing to blow up artifacts and enchantments. And then the mana base is nice and simple with just Caves of Hoylos, a couple of Dust Bowl, and then an even split of Plains and Swamps. So you have tons and tons of mana with this deck, and you can also interact with your opponent's mana base with Dust Bowl a little bit. The sideboard is also pretty simple. We're on a few Circle of Protection red to help deal with goblins and burn. To deal with goblins and elves, we have a few Engineered Plague. This is definitely one of the best tools to deal with those decks. We have a few Hypnotic Spectre, because if there is a matchup where we need to kind of go fast and get out threats early, Hypnotic Spectre is a very good one to get out, because it kind of needs to be immediately answered, or we're going to run away with the game by making our opponent lose a card every single turn. We have a couple of Seal of Cleansing for decks like Replenish and Dreadnought, where we're going to need to blow up artifacts and enchantments. A Tormod's Crypt to go with our couple of Phyrexian Furnaces, but this is going to be more for unfair graveyard decks rather than Phyrexian Furnace, which could be better against like Survival or more fair graveyard strategies. And we have a couple of Warmth to help deal with burn, and then 1 Wrath of God to help deal with the creature decks. So this is a kind of well-rounded deck. As you can see, it's very much just black-white good stuff. It definitely struggles against Parallax Tide, like I said, because it needs to get its land drops down. But if you're able to dodge Armageddons and Parallax Tides for a day, this is a absolutely great one to do it with, and you could have a very good shot at winning a tournament for under $75. And the last deck that I want to highlight for the day is Blue-Green Madness. This is more of an aggressive or mid-range deck. We're going to be trying to use a lot of high synergy cards where we are discarding cards that have Madness in order to get value, often with things like Careful Study and Frantic Search. That can be by gaining card advantage as well. And we also have Squeeze, which you can discard to get advantage and pump things like Wild Mongrels. This deck is just a lot of fun and is a great mid-range to aggressive strategy. And there's a lot of customization for it. Let's look at how I built it. We're going to be playing a few Aquamoeba as well as 4 Wild Mongrel. These are kind of the heart of the deck, these creatures. They're just 2-drops that let you discard to give them good effects. Aquamoeba switching its power and toughness to become a 3/1 or a 1/3, and Wild Mongrel pumping itself by 1 and changing its color. These things can both get in very, very quickly and efficiently. Playing a few Arrogant Worms and 4 Basking Root Wallas, 4 and 4. These are your best Madness targets for the most part. They're just very, very efficient, as a 0-mana 1/1 that can get pumped to a 3/3 is very, very good in this format, and a 3-mana 4/4 is absolutely awesome as well. And you can use instant speed with Madness, so these things essentially have flash if you're using the right cards with them, so they're very, very, very strong and can blow out your opponent really well. For Squee, this card comes back from your graveyard at the beginning of your upkeep, so it is absolutely great to discard. So we can use it to pump our Wild Mongrel over and over again, or just get value with our other effects like Waterfront Bouncer, which is a 1-of. This lets you discard cards from your hand to bounce things, so it is great at dealing with problematic creatures your opponent is playing, and lets you convert your extra cards in hand into advantage very quickly. And we're also playing a 1-of Wonder. If you have an island and this thing is in your yard, your creatures have flying, so we can discard this to help our creatures crash in for that last bit of damage. The sorceries we're playing for Careful Study. This is one that's cheaper in gold border as well, so I recommend getting that. This is just a 1 mana draw 2 then discard 2, so it's kind of like worse Faithless Looting, but it is very, very strong because it lets us discard our things like Basking Rootwalla as early as turn 1. We have a couple of Deep Analysis, which can be flashed back to draw 2 cards for only 2 mana, which is absolutely great, but we can also just cast this thing on its front side for 4 mana if we need some card advantage. We're also on a 1-of Roar of the Worm, which also has a very efficient flashback cost for only 4 mana. We can make a 6/6, that's absolutely great. We're on a couple of Circular Logic. This card also has Madness and is a very efficient counterspell as it counters based on the number of cards that we have in our yard, which we should be able to fill up pretty quickly. We're on a 1-of Daze. This card is pretty good. People have been playing more. Some people don't play it at all, but I like to just have a singleton copy to make my opponents play around it. I'm on a few Frantic Search. This card is absolutely great, and a notable interaction if you are new to Premodern. This thing will untap your lands already in order to cast Arrogant Worm, so because the Frantic Search has to fully resolve, which will have all of its effects resolved, including the untapping 3 lands when the Madness trigger goes in the stack. So you already have your mana to cast Arrogant Worm if you'd like. We also have a few Mana Leaks as just a great piece of interaction, and a 1-of Naturalize. If you're in green, you should probably be playing at least 1 Naturalize in your main deck. It's just a very, very good piece of removal in this format. The land base is nice and simple, 8 forests, 10 islands, and 4 Yavimaya Coast. We just need to get our mana, and islands are a little bit more important for us than forests. And then the sideboard is also pretty simple, just playing some of the best blue-green cards. We're on a couple of Annul to deal with artifacts and enchantments, particularly Parallax Tide, because that one can't really be destroyed to stop its powerful effect. You're going to need to counter it. We're on a whole bunch of Hydroblast, or 1 Hydroblast and 4 Blue Elemental Blast, just because Blue Elemental Blast is cheaper. But we want 5 Blue Blast effects so that we can destroy red decks very efficiently. We have a couple of Naturalizes to help deal with artifacts and enchantments as well, a couple of Phyrexian Furnaces in the board to deal with graveyards, and a Tranquil Domain to deal with enchantments, particularly Replenish. And then Unsummons to deal with early creature decks and just to deal with any maybe creatures that would stop us from winning the game, or maybe like reanimated creatures that are going to be great to put back in their hand. And then 1 other Waterfront Bouncer on the board to help deal with those kind of unfair creature decks as well, so that we can keep putting those things back in their hands. This is a super, super fun list as well, and I really encourage you guys to try it out if you have not before. But that is going to do it for the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all of your viewership. Remember, like I said, if you have friends who are trying to get into Premodern, I would recommend sharing this video with them, as this should be a great resource for newer players. But I appreciate everything, and I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Let me know if you have any other cool decks that you think are great on a budget that people should try out. Have a good one, everyone.